Today we're going to talk about a couple battles. The first was just what the book called the disaster in New York. It doesn't even call it a battle. So the first one we're going to talk about is the battle in New York and why it was a disaster. So New York has its islands, right? This is like, what's it called in art when you do a negative? Isn't that like pictures that are like reverse colors and stuff like that? Or you can draw on the negative, like instead of drawing this table, I could draw the space where the legs aren't, and then it would leave it right. Imagine this is like a negative map, and I'm drawing in blue. So what is this? It's water, right? So this is the water, right? And then you have the island of New York, which actually should be a little bit more tilted northeast and west or whatever. But there's rivers and there's a lot of water. It's a good advantage for the British because they have warships and the Americans do not. So they can go on water and you can't. If you're like playing a board game, it's like the British can go wherever they want, and the Americans are stuck where they're at. Well, this ends up mattering quite a bit later. But first, the Americans are defending, and the cities are here, right? There's towns everywhere, and the Americans make fortifications. And something kind of, to cut the story short, Nathaniel Greene gets sick. And you have thousands of people, right, working, and Nathaniel Greene gets sick. He's in charge of the fortifications, like right here. He gets sick and they don't get finished. But Washington doesn't know, because he's doing his job. Everyone's busy doing their own thing, and they don't realize that they have a problem. Well, the British end up landing, and they spread out, and eventually they find the gap in the fortifications. They get around them, and they're able to flank the Americans. So now the Americans who are shooting this way are suddenly getting attacked from here. They're getting blindsided, right? They can't see what's coming. And so a general rout happens, and the Americans have to fall back. That's the disaster in New York, is the British. At first, everything's going fine, but when the British start to send people out to look, they find a gap. And the reason the gap was there, it's just kind of an unlucky thing. Nathaniel Greene gets sick, and the ball gets dropped, so to speak, on hey, who didn't finish the trench, right? So the disaster in New York, the Americans have to basically give up the island, and they get pinned against a river. And they're able to get across the river, and here's a weird one. Here's where things get weird. It's unexplainable, right? First of all, when the British had tried to go up the Hudson River multiple times, every time they tried for 2 weeks. Because if they could bring their warships up the river, they could just shoot the cannons into the city and stuff like that. They would be able to form a wall. They couldn't get up the river. Why? Every time they tried to go up the river, a wind would come out of nowhere and blow them out. Remember, these are sailboats, right? It's just a weird thing. For 2 weeks, no wind. They're like, oh, the wind died, we can go. And then every time they try to go, boom, they're blown out. It's huh? It's one of those things where, is it superstition? Is it divine intervention, right? What's going on there? That's an unprovable thing. But when I read about it, it's just one of those things somebody's hand at work here, right? That's just how it feels. Another thing that happens is the Americans are trapped with their backs against the river. The British are closing in. And when nightfall happens, a fog falls just on the American army. And the fog is so dense, the British can't see them anymore, and they're able to sneak across the river, right, and get away when they were trapped. They make rafts, and they slowly get everyone across the river under the cover of a dense fog that comes out of nowhere and only covers their army. It's things like this are just, I told you the 1812 story where Washington was on fire, and a storm comes out of nowhere, and a tornado drops on the British. It's the things that I read, and it's huh? Right? It seems like Old Testament, doesn't it? It's does this happen? A tornado dropped on their army, right? Storm came out of nowhere and put the fire out. It's just weird stuff, right? But it's unprovable types of things. So anyway, that's the disaster in New York, where it's basically the Americans, they try to fight, and they dug in the trenches, but trenches don't move. And so when the British are able to get around it, the defenses basically fail. And they fail multiple times, and the Americans, they start to, they're scared of dying, because everyone's scared of dying, but they start to get used to losing, basically. And so every time they try to stand up to the British, and it's about 9 times in a row, where they get, every time they try to fight the British, they end up running away, something goes wrong. There is actually times where the Americans, like the guys who stand and fight, they all get killed, right? So sometimes Washington watches them run away, and he says, how can I win with them? And sometimes when he's watching, he's like, oh my gosh, all these brave men I'm losing. But it's like he's just losing over and over and over for different reasons. So that's the disaster in New York. It all comes down to they didn't get to finish the defenses and they get flanked, and it leads to like dominoes. Loss, okay? They get bounced across the Delaware River eventually, and we're kind of skipping towards winter. The second one would be Trenton and Princeton. Princeton I'm not actually going to talk that much about. The Battle of Trenton is the famous one with Washington on the ship like this, right? And they're rowing across an icy river. That's the famous one, right?
Wasn't Monroe holding the flag?
I don't know.
Amos said that Monroe was holding the flag.
Actually, you're right, because I'm going to talk about him. So he actually is a key thing in the battle. So the Battle of Trenton, Washington is down to like 2,400 troops is what the book says. He started with like 20,000, he's down to 2,000.
How many
Right.
troops did the British have?
Huh?
How many troops did the British have at this
They had like 30-something thousand, I think maybe 36. Now here's the thing that you have to know about our armies, and I'm glad you asked. So Washington, let's just say he's here. There's a river here, and the British are over here, but in real life, it's not like, gosh, it's board games, video games, whatever it is. When you move your piece, a piece can like be like 10,000 or it can be 500, right? A piece can be whatever number. But when you move it on a board, everything's in one spot. In real life, it's not like that. When you move an army, it takes up a large area because it's thousands of people, right? And you have to feed these thousands of people. And here's kind of a gross thing also that you have to think about when you're doing armies. This is actually one of the most important things. Harder than feeding your soldiers, you have to find spots for them to poop and pee. Because it's so many people in one spot that the ground will get gross, the water gets dirty. It's actually one of the things when Baron von Steuben comes to the American camp, he teaches them how to dig better toilets because everyone was getting sick. Because it's old times, right? They don't just turn on the faucet. So where are they getting their water? They get it from wells or they get it from rivers. Well, if you have like 30,000 people pooping in the same spot, it gets in the water. Isn't that gross? It's like something you have to think about. And it explains, well, how come the British, why would you ever divide your army? Why would you make it easy for you to be beat? It's like, because you'll die of sickness if you don't. So that's one of the weird things that a lot of times we don't tell people, like, hey, how come they split up their forces? Isn't that dumb? Well, you kind of have to when you have a lot of people. So when winter comes, a lot of times people will know about winter quarters. You guys ever heard of that? Like, oh, they stopped for the winter and they kind of just, everyone just chilled out. Have you guys ever heard about they stopped for winter? When you stop for winter, you have to find, oh, the other thing, like firewood, for example, if everyone's in the same spot, you'll literally run out of trees. So you just have to spread out. So the British, they stop for winter. It's December now, right? This is a Christmas attack. That's when the attack happened. It's winter, so they need to spread out for firewood and stuff like that. And so Washington, who has, we'll just call it 2K, right? He actually has a little more than that. He's now in a position where even though the British have thousands of soldiers more than him, if he can isolate one of these little camps without the other ones knowing, he can get a fair fight. And he figures that out. Across the river, there's a Hessian camp that he thinks he can take because it's like 1,500 guys. So he outnumbers them. It's like, finally, I found a fight that I can actually take. And so, like, let's say, I don't know, let's say it's this group right here. I just drew kind of random dots. But he's like, I'm going to try to fight just this dot without the other ones knowing. And if I drawn this to scale, the dots would be way more spread out, by the way. But he starts his attack. A lot of people think it was just a surprise attack out of nowhere. That's actually not what happens. What you have to do is, each of these dots, you would have to imagine, it's almost like electrons or something. You send out patrols and you make sure no one's attacking you when you're at war. People stay up during the night, right? You go out, you walk the roads. And so, like, let's say there's patrols here. Washington send people out to start eliminating the patrols, right? Hiding in, hiding in the bushes and whatever, and when their patrol comes by, you start grabbing guys and you stab them, you shoot them, or whatever it is, right? You take them prisoner. So first, a week before the attack happens, Johann Rall, the Hessian commander, realizes his letters aren't being answered. He's writing letters to other people saying like, hey, we need more, I don't know, whiskey, we need more bullets, we need this, we need that. And nothing's coming back to him. And he realizes he's being surrounded. Now the funny thing about Johann Rall, he was the Hessian commander. And they were famous, not only were they German, Hesse is a German province. They were hired soldiers, they were mercenaries. And they were famous for being really good with the bayonet. Right? The bayonet is like the sword at the end of a rifle. Right? And their bayonet was like 16 inches long. It was like a full-size sword at the end of their rifle. And they had a lot of success just stabbing Americans. In those 9 losses that I told you about, the Hessians were having a lot of fun because the Americans, a lot of them didn't even have bayonets. So when they got charged, Americans had to swing their rifles like a baseball bat, and all they had to do was poke you. And it was a lot easier to poke somebody than it is to take a big swing and hit them. So the Hessians were stabbing everybody and just having a great time. Yeah.
So I would think that poking someone with a sharp knife or thing, that would more likely hurt them, yes. But hitting people, like, that also could hurt, like, that more effective.
Yeah, but it's easier to, if I just come up and how quick that is, as opposed to like winding up and having to hit somebody. So the knife, the stabbing of the bayonet was just better than so the Americans were losing because they don't have as good of a tool for fighting. Okay. Now Johann Rall, he was an older guy and getting a little bit lazier and also getting complacent, and he was also getting arrogant. And so when he was at camp, his other soldiers, like his captains, his lieutenants, they said, hey, should we make fortifications, like in case the Americans attack? He's like, them attacking us? They barely have an army left. And if they do attack us, and here's the specific quote, we'll just go at them with the bayonet. Because over and over and over, they had stabbed the Americans and made them look really bad. So he said, we don't need to defend ourselves. Well, his patrols start disappearing, and then Johann Rall starts getting a little bit scared. How did they know where the Hessians were? How did they know how many there were? There was a spy named John Honeyman. And this is an example. Sometimes we say that Washington didn't outfight the British. Sometimes we say he outspied them. I'll give you an example here, but since you guys have to move so quickly through the book, sometimes you can't slow down and enjoy the stories. But John Honeyman was the bartender in Trenton. And the Hessians didn't know he was a spy. And so he would serve them food and drink and whatever, and like, hey, and he would get paid by them, but also he was sitting there because he's like a waiter or whatever, and they would talk and he would listen. And John Honeyman, how do you get your spy in and out without somebody knowing, right? Because there's patrols. Well, he went for a walk one night just because he needed some fresh air. And one of those remember the Americans were attacking people that were outside the Trenton? They were attacking patrols. They end up capturing John Honeyman by accident on purpose. Does that make sense? So John Honeyman's just walking around like, oh no, what if someone kidnaps me? Right? He gets kidnapped. Now the soldiers that take him, they don't know that he's a spy. Because nobody can know you're a spy. You'd be a bad spy then, right? They bring him back to Washington, and Washington interrogates him, and they actually beat him up. They beat up John Honeyman. Tell us what you know. And then John Honeyman's like, okay, and he tells them everything. Right, but now the soldiers like, Mr. Washington, should we put him in a cage? Should we jail him? Should we tie him up? What should we do with this guy that we caught? And Washington's like, oh, I don't know, and like knocks over a lamp on purpose and starts a fire. And when they're all going to put the fire out, John Honeyman runs away. Doesn't this just sound like a movie?
Yeah.
Just sounds like ridiculous, but that's what happens. John Honeyman makes his way back to this river. This line was a river. It's all in blue. I did a horrible job. He makes his way back to the river and like rows across the river. He runs back to the Hessians. Oh, thank God I'm back. The Americans, they got me, but I didn't tell them anything. Well, he told them everything he knew. Okay. So that's an example of John Honeyman was a spy, and he told them about, hey, this Johann Rall guy, he didn't even set up defenses. He's telling them stuff like that. So the Americans realize this is going well. We have them kind of isolated. They don't have defenses. It's time for an attack. They don't know that a blizzard's coming, but that's what ends up happening. So George Washington sends some guys in from this side because he's trying to surround them, right? And then him and his force, they go from this side, but it ends up being like a 3 a.m., 4 a.m. blizzard. And that's when the attack starts. So it's dark, and it's like one of those heavy ones. Now, you guys live in Minnesota, North Dakota type thing, so you know when it's like white out and you've got it in your face, you know, and it's just hitting you. And these guys, a lot of them don't even have shoes. So they were getting lost, except people start getting frostbite so bad that you don't have to see who's in front of you, you just follow the bloody footprints. That's how bad things were. Like, these are the last 2,000 Americans that they had, right? And they're following bloody footprints to make sure that they don't get lost. They end up, there was roads going, you know, in and out of here. These people end up getting delayed, and George Washington doesn't know it because they don't have walkie-talkies, they don't have phones. So you go over the plan, and then whatever happens, happens. These guys get delayed, so they show up late, but George Washington and his men, including Monroe, they show up, and because of the blizzard, their guns don't work. Because back then, I don't know if you've ever seen it, they had like matchlock and wheel-lock muskets where it had a fuse, and then the fuse had to hit the gunpowder, that type of thing, or they had percussion cap. The gunpowder's wet. It won't blow up. It's like trying to start a fire with wet wood. It doesn't work. So what do the Americans have to use instead?
Swords.
Those of them that have bayonets have to use the bayonet. They have to swing their rifles, and if they have knives, yeah, this is not a gunfight. And what did Johann Rall said though would happen if the Americans came? We'll use our bayonets, right, and we're gonna win. This time they don't win. In fact, the Americans kill hundreds and only lose like 5 guys, and out of those 5 guys, half were actually to the blizzard. People froze. So it's like devastating for the Hessians. Well, how come that day the Hessians weren't better in the knife fight? A couple of reasons. One, the blizzard, coincidentally, was in their faces. Which, I don't know if you guys have ever walked in a blizzard. If it's behind you, it's not nearly as bad, right? When the wind's at your back and all the snow's going this way, it's actually not that bad. But when it's in your face, how bad is it? It's horrible, isn't it? That's what the Hessians are dealing with. When they look at the Americans, it's just ice in their eyes. It's like, you know, they're doing this, and boom, they get stabbed, or boom, they get hit, right? So it's like the Americans are just coming with the blizzard. Perfect. The other reason that the Hessians lose the knife fight that day, especially this bad, the blizzard doesn't really explain all of it. They were sleep deprived. Your book actually says that they were drunk from Christmas. That's not what happened. In fact, the Americans were really upset because when they got to the town, they couldn't find any alcohol. They couldn't even find traces of it. They thought they would be drunk. That's what Washington said. Hey guys, we're going to hit them on Christmas because they're going to be drunk. That's not what happened. They were actually really disappointed. The Hessians had run out of alcohol way before that. Remember, for a couple weeks, the Americans were attacking their patrols. Well, one of the things Johann Rall was asking for was like whiskey and stuff. So they didn't have any drink. So why did it seem like they were drunk? They were sleep deprived. Johann Rall, when he realizes his letters aren't being returned, starts keeping his men up. He has them sleep in their uniforms, they're holding their guns, and that happens for like 3 or 4 days before the Americans attack. So they weren't sleeping. And so when a knife fight happens, they're tired. And it's 3 or 4 in the morning and the Americans show up, right? So it's just all these little things went perfectly. The Americans win, they end up going up, and they go up the road like right after it, and they attack another little camp. Same story. So they win 2 victories, Trenton and Princeton. And it's a Christmas miracle, so to speak. After that, Washington, remember, their contracts were up at the New Year, so Christmas is like a week before New Year. When it comes time to re-enlist, everyone was ready to re-enlist, right? No, actually they tried to leave. And like Washington wouldn't let them. And he gives them this speech. He's on his horse and he's like, any man who wants to re-enlist, great victories, boys. Who wants to do another one? And they're all in line. And he's like, whoever wants to fight with me, step forward. And nobody moves. It's actually kind of funny. And then he gives a speech kind of like these are the times to try men's souls. I don't know what Washington said, but he gives them the rah-rah speech, right? And nobody moves. Like, we want to go home, right? And so then what does he do? He says, I'll give you an extra $10 for everyone that steps up. And then like people are like, it's a lot of money. Where do you get the $10? From It was a famous dentist. I think his last name was Burke. The book actually says who it was that funded the bonuses. I think it was Edmund Burke. He was a rich dentist. He paid for the re-enlistments. Okay. Thomas Paine does a good job of writing about these are the times that try men's souls. That was this stuff. They're fighting in a blizzard with no shoes. He spreads the word about the victories, and people start signing up. This victory saves the revolution. So he's down from his last 2,000, and then he gets a lot more after that. So, all right. So that is a surrounding attack. Now the next stuff, it goes through like Valley Forge, which is another winter. But before that, I want to talk about Saratoga, which is the turning point. The next summer, they fight at Saratoga. And it's a similar thing where the British are trying to use a river that divides this time. Oh, I'm sorry, it's the Hudson, and I'm trying to do my geography. Here's Maine and whatever. There's a river right here that goes up and down. The British were going to use it like a wall to divide the colonies. And the Navy would go from this side, and it was going to go up the river. And then up here is Canada. They were going to bring an army down, and they were going to bring an army up. And they were going to meet in the middle and form a wall dividing the colonies. Okay. The problem is this guy down here, he goes to Philadelphia because it was the American capital, and he wants to be a hero. And so this army right here gets left thinking that British soldiers are going to come help them, but the guy doesn't go. He ends up going to Philadelphia and kicks his feet up and says, oh, wow, isn't this great? I'm a hero. I took their capital. Which didn't really matter. It was embarrassing for the Americans, but the guys who were there for Congress, like Ben Franklin, whoever, they just left. Right? So they just walked out, and the British had Philadelphia. This army ends up getting surrounded when they were in the woods by Benedict Arnold, Horatio Gates, guys like that. Benedict Arnold, by the way, gets in trouble during this battle. He wants to attack, but they realize that they have the British surrounded. And Horatio Gates says, we don't need to attack. They have to surrender. They can't get out. Benedict Arnold charges anyway, defies orders, and they win the fight actually, but Benedict Arnold, instead of them saying, hey, good job, Benedict, you won the battle, he said, I told you not to go fight, and he tells Washington about it, and he's in trouble. So now Benedict Arnold didn't get the credit at Fort Ticonderoga for stealing cannons, and he doesn't get credit at Saratoga for starting the battle that he wasn't supposed to start. But they win. So now two times in a row, Benedict Arnold's like, I did great things, and no one says thank you. So then what does he do later? Do you know?
Well, I think doesn't he become a traitor, and then they make a statue to his leg because
He was shot twice in the leg.
because the sculptor would not dare say his name. I don't know why at the time being, but Audra, isn't it like that little yellow slip? That's about the statue I read from, the statue to his leg. I'm like, wow, what a weird thing.
He got shot twice in the leg. That's why. Yeah.
And then afterwards, he became a bad guy. So he was like pretty much a good guy before his leg got shot.
He gets in trouble, and said they remove him from important duties, and they put him in charge of West Point. You guys heard of West Point
That's
before?
because he asked to be put in West Point.
Yeah.
Just so he'd be less noticed.
Yep. And then he starts writing to the British, and he says, I'm in charge of this fort. I'll give it to you. That's the traitor part. Yep. So once he's in charge of this
But
fort,
it doesn't work.
it doesn't work.
The spy catches him.
Yeah, he gets caught by spies. That's another example, and I wish I could tell you more about. If you're a history nerd, Culper spy ring is one of the most famous spy rings, and the leader of it was Washington, but actually they didn't know till pretty recently. And he had his own, I forget what his number was, but you know how like 007 is James Bond? Washington had his own number. I don't remember what it was. It was like 313 or something like that. And it took a long time for people. You should look it up. It takes a long time for them to figure out who agent, and I forget what Washington's number was, but it was only pretty recently that they figured out, oh my gosh.
How is it so recent though? Is it because they couldn't figure it out either?
I think somebody's like inheritance, like grandma, grandpa dies, and they're like digging through letters. If you look it up, somebody knew, but they kept it a secret, and I think it's kind of like my family. We had a family secret that I only found out recently that my grandma was actually like a secret agent in country. She was like a bodyguard for a princess in Iran. Well, it was a family secret. You couldn't tell anybody. And so I only just found out I'm 34, and because people got used to never saying anything. And so a couple of years ago, I found out. And I'm like, why didn't you tell me? They're like, oh, we forgot. We forgot you didn't know. So, and I was a kid, I would have said, because now I'm a teacher. It's recording, but my grandma, she's dead, so they can't do anything to her. She can't be tortured anymore. So. Okay, so starts with a disaster in New York, where they get flanked. Trenton and Princeton, the Americans are able to surround a small piece. Saratoga, it's not a small piece, it's actually like 8,000 British get surrounded and they quit. As a result of Saratoga, when they eliminated an entire British army, 8,000 guys, that's like a quarter of the men that they had. Spain and France, so the result of it, the important thing, is that Spain and France joined the war, realizing that all the British soldiers are in America, so if they attack them everywhere else, the British can't handle it, right? So they get brave and they decide to jump in. So that's the really important thing, is that the Americans don't do it alone, okay? You guys know about Valley Forge, hopefully, you've heard of it. Now, it has a reputation for being a horrible winter. A lot of the guys actually didn't have a bad time, but because the Americans were disorganized, some guys didn't get food, some guys didn't get shoes, and some guys were having the time of their lives. So it was like poor organization. And the winter there actually wasn't that bad for our standards. It was like 30 degrees. So for us, it's like, that's cold, but we know it's like, you can handle it.
Like, that's nothing.
So it is legendary, but if you ask someone from California what 30 degrees feels like,
That's their coldest.
yeah, they think that they'll die, right? And so it kind of, I don't know what to say about books that are like, Valley Forge was horrible. It's like, if you're not used to it, it was horrible. But if you like told us to live that way, I think we would actually be like, oh, we're just camping, you know? It doesn't seem that bad. So, while they're there, Washington gets Baron von Steuben, his name is, to teach the Americans how to fight like organized and in lines and use the bayonet and like all these things. They get extra supplies from the Marquis de Lafayette, a rich noble from France who was a young guy who ends up spreading the revolution into France, but he believed in liberty, equality, all the American ideas, and it goes badly in France. He ends up having to leave because Napoleon's going to kill him and stuff. But he's interesting. Lafayette spends his own money and buys the Americans coats so that they're not as cold at Valley Forge. So he's putting his own money in, and he ends up being a hero. Okay, so and then that kind of brings us to the war in the South. I don't know if you guys can handle another battle. We can handle one more. Do we even have time?
10 minutes.
10 minutes? Oh gosh. Okay, let's speed run it. Battle of Cowpens is a great example of the battle in the South. And Cowpens sounds funny, but that's literally where they were. They were in somebody's farm, somebody's backyard. I think it was called Hannah or Sarah's Cowpens, I don't remember. Probably says in the book. It's Hannah's Cowpens. The British end up chasing the Americans in the South kind of all around. And one of the guys that they had chasing the Americans was a guy named Bannister Tarleton. Tarleton was nicknamed the Butcher because when Americans tried to surrender to him, he killed them anyway, which is not allowed. If they say that they surrender, you're not allowed to kill them anyway. So he was called Bannister the Butcher Tarleton. He was a young, aggressive guy. He was like 26 years old. Apparently he was super strong, but he was like a cavalryman and he would run guys down and slash them from his horse. That's what he was famous for. He was against Daniel Morgan, who was an old man, a veteran of the French and Indian War. So how does he fight, do you think? You think he fights on horseback and stuff? What did they learn in the French and Indian War?
Don't fight on horseback, fight in the trees.
Yeah, hide behind trees in a gunfight. Daniel Morgan was famous for having riflemen and snipers, and they would hide in the swamps and hide in the trees and whatever, and if British patrols came by, they would shoot them and shoot the officers and stuff. So he was kind of a sneaky guy, and he's really aggressive. So he's tricky, and he would just go straight forward. This battle is exactly that. Tarleton's men were chasing Daniel Morgan's men, and Daniel Morgan lays a trap. Every time the Americans fought the British, they ran away. And so Daniel Morgan says, hey, good news, boys. This time, I'm going to let you run away. I'm not even going to be mad at you, right? So he sets up on a hill, and he sets up his defensive lines kind of like this, going up the hill. And Tarleton shows up. Should I do him in red maybe? Let's start getting fancy. And he just sees that the Americans are trapped by a river and that they can't run away. anymore. And he says, finally, they can't run away, and if they do, they'll drown, and I'll stab them, and right, they're trapped. Got them trapped. And so Tarleton charges right away at the Americans, even though his men haven't rested, they didn't eat, they didn't drink, and in fact, they hadn't rested, eat, drink for like a day, because they actually chased the Americans overnight trying to catch them, right? So he charges immediately, and according to the plan, which actually works, Daniel Morgan's men shoot once, and then they run away and act scared. Actually, they didn't go this way. They all went the right way. Sorry. So they end up going this way, and they hide behind the hill. And the British keep charging. Now they have to get a second line. Same thing, where the Americans, instead of going around the hill, these guys go up the hill. And the British keep charging up the hill. So now they've run hundreds of yards. They haven't slept, they didn't eat, they didn't drink. But they're charging because their officers tell them to. Well, Daniel Morgan's men start shooting the officers, and now there's no one to tell the British guys to stop or turn around or reload, anything like that, because everything a British soldier did was off of what he was told to do. So they just keep charging because that's what they were told. And now the guys who were supposed to tell them to stop are dead. They get to the top of the hill. The Americans keep acting like they're scared and running away, and then when they get to the top of the hill and the British are close enough, they turn around and they shoot them point blank. So it's like, oh no, we're so scared. Hope you don't catch me. And then right when the British are about to stab them with the bayonet, they just shoot them point blank. And a bunch of the British are dead right there. The ones who aren't dead surrender because they've lost the battle. And Bannister Tarleton sees all this, right? And he's on a horse. Well, while the charge was happening, a guy named Washington, but not the Washington you're thinking of, his cousin, rides out on a horse, and he's yelling for Tarleton, Tarleton, where are you? Tarleton, I'm gonna get you. Tarleton, I heard about what you did, you butcher, right? He's taunting him. And Tarleton sees him, right? He takes his sword out, he takes his pistol out, and the Washington, the cousin, the less famous Washington, goes for to strike him, and Tarleton, the British guy, instead of actually fighting him, shoots his horse and then rides away. And so Washington falls over. He's like, you coward! Yeah. But it all works out in the end. So Tarleton, he runs away from this battle. His whole army's been destroyed. But you know what happens to Tarleton later? You guys know? You want to know about justice?
Does he die?
No. Well, yeah, eventually. Yeah. That's cheating. You can't just say that.
Does he get utterly humiliated?
Utterly humiliated? No. So he goes back to England after the war. So he runs away from here, and he's not really relevant after that. He goes back to England, and they actually give him a big prize because of all the battles he had won. He becomes rich and famous as a general, and then he marries a beautiful girl. But then you know what happens? He dumps that girl and then marries a girl that he thinks is actually more beautiful. But then you know what happens? He lives happily ever after with his money and his beautiful wife and dies peacefully. I love doing that. You guys are really mad right now. You set us up. Yeah, I did. Yeah. So his justice was not served maybe on this planet, but who knows? Who knows if he believed in Jesus or not. So.
Well, if he didn't believe in Jesus, then he got his justice completely.
Huh?
If he didn't believe in Jesus, then he got his justice completely.
Yeah, you'd be happy about that? Oh, that's not very Christian. That's not very Christian of you. So that is like speed run.